They said, "You'll get nothing." She said it so calmly, so clinically, that I almost thought she was reading a weather report. No anger, no trembling, not even a raised brow. Just that small, deliberate tightening of her mouth, the same look she gave waiters when the soup came lukewarm. "You'll get nothing," she said again, and slid the papers toward me across the dining table, as though it were some kind of transaction instead of a declaration. I didn't look down at them right away. I kept my eyes on her instead, on the daughter I had carried in my arms through 2 winters of fever, the woman who once used to braid my hair on Sundays when my arthritis was bad. I looked at her and thought, that's what I made. That's what I raised into the world. And I felt something close to wonder, though not the good kind. I am 81 now. I live alone above a bakery that opens before dawn and smells of yeast and sugar and something almost like forgiveness. I rent the little flat month to month, and I like the sound of the mixer downstairs, the steady rhythm of dough being beaten into shape. It reminds me that transformation is still possible, even for something that's been needed too long. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to live out my days in the house by the lake, the one Arthur and I built in our 50s, the one with the blue shutters and the plum tree that never bore fruit but kept trying every spring. That house was meant to be mine until I left this world, or so I believed. But belief is a fragile thing when other people decide what's best for you. The day Evelyn told me I'd get nothing, the house was full of light. Late autumn, sharp and honest. The table was laid for what she called a simple family lunch. She'd made roast chicken with rosemary, my recipe, though she never admitted it. Her husband, Robert, was talking about the new car, something German with too many buttons, and I was half listening, thinking about how Arthur used to polish his old Buick on Sundays until it looked like rain itself would slide off out of respect. When she said it, when those 4 words came, I didn't understand them at first. I thought she meant a joke, a misunderstanding. Then I saw the papers. Then I understood. It's strange how betrayal can sound so calm. You imagine shouting, drama, some visible rupture in the air, but real betrayal comes quietly. It sits in the throat, in the pause between syllables. It's administrative, bureaucratic. It has bullet points and signatures. Evelyn had the language for it. She'd always been good with words that closed doors gently. "It's all been arranged," she said, and poured herself more wine. I watched the red swirl into the glass, dark as old blood, and thought how easy it was for her to drink after ending a lifetime of trust. She'd come into money the kind that changes tone and posture, a promotion, a house with too many rooms, a lawyer friend who knew a few things about estate planning. After my husband died, she began managing everything. She said it kindly at first, that I shouldn't have to worry about numbers or signatures. "Just let me handle it, Mom," she'd said, voice sweet, with rehearsed patience. I let her. I wanted to believe it was love disguised as efficiency. But love doesn't usually come with notary stamps. That night, after the lunch, I sat alone in the small back room she called the guest suite, though it had been my room when Arthur was alive. His books were gone, the shelves replaced with beige storage boxes labeled in neat handwriting, seasonal decor, linens miscellaneous. My husband was now miscellaneous. I sat on the bed and listened to the sound of Evelyn's laughter drifting down the hallway, thin and polished, like something she practiced in front of a mirror. She was hosting again. Friends from work, perhaps, people who thought of her as generous and composed. I imagined her pouring wine, smiling that perfect host smile, and saying, "Oh, Mom's resting. She tires easily these days. It's the kind of line people accept without question, because it's true enough to sound kind. I didn't cry. I haven't cried in years. The tears stopped when Arthur did. What replaced them is quieter but heavier, a kind of still weight that presses against the ribs but never spills over. I took off the necklace he'd given me on our 30th anniversary, the one Evelyn once admired but never wore because it was a bit too old-fashioned. I laid it on the nightstand and thought about how easily a lifetime can become a transaction. You'll get nothing. Such a small sentence, such a precise incision. The funny thing is, she didn't mean it as cruelty. She meant it as fact. To her, the estate, the accounts, the house, they were logistics, not legacy. She spoke about property the way people talk about groceries, efficiently, detached. She said, "It's better this way. Cleaner, fewer complications." Cleaner. That word has haunted me. I think of bleach. I think of erasure. I think of the way she wiped her fingerprints off my life with the same calm she used to fold her napkin after dinner. I used to think motherhood was a permanent thing, like handwriting on a stone. You give, you teach, you forgive, and somehow that love roots itself deep enough to last past reason. But now I know it's conditional, not on love itself, but on usefulness. When you stop being useful, they start talking about independence. Yours first, then theirs. Mom, you should enjoy your freedom. That's what she said when she moved me into the smaller bedroom and repainted the walls a neutral cream. Freedom. That's a beautiful word when it's a choice, and a cruel one when it's a sentence. So yes, I live above a bakery now. I make my own tea, buy my own groceries, and walk to the post office every Friday to send small packages to people who still remember my name. The girl at the counter calls me Miss Harlow, and I like the formality. It reminds me that I'm not anyone's burden here. Sometimes I pass the mirror in the hallway and catch sight of myself. Hair silver, shoulders stooped, but eyes sharp as ever. And I think, this is the woman she thought could be erased with a signature. There's a freedom in being stripped of everything. You stop pretending. You stop waiting for phone calls that don't come. You start noticing small mercies, the warmth of bread through a paper bag, the hum of an old radio, the way morning light lands on a chipped teacup. I used to think dignity was something people gave you, but I've learned it's what you keep when they take everything else. Still, I remember that moment at the table with the clarity of a photograph, the way her hand rested casually on the stack of documents, her nails perfect, the gold bracelet winking in the light, the way her husband avoided my eyes, the way I smiled anyway. I even thanked her for being so organized. She seemed relieved. She thought I was surrendering. Maybe I was, but not the way she imagined. Because even then, before I knew what I would do, before the long nights and the quiet planning and the envelope I'd one day slide across her own table, I understood something vital. You can't unmake a mother, no matter how many papers you file. You can rewrite her name out of deeds and wills, but you can't erase the part of her that remembers the smell of your hair when you were small, or the way you used to run to her after nightmares. She can still see the child inside the woman who calls her obsolete. And that vision, that unbroken thread of memory, is stronger than any signature. So I said nothing then. I folded the papers, placed them gently in my bag, and smiled. I complimented the chicken. I even asked for seconds. But in my chest, something shifted. Something solid clicked into place, like the sound of a lock turning from the inside. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud and short-lived. This was quieter, a kind of knowing, the kind that stays. And as I walked out to the porch after dinner, the sky bruised with evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. She thought she'd taken everything, but what she didn't know was that she had given me something back, the truth of who she'd become, and the permission to stop pretending she was anything else. That's the moment my story began, not with loss, but with clarity. "You'll get nothing," she said, and I thought finally, I have nothing left to lose. It started months before that lunch, though I didn't see it for what it was then. Betrayal never arrives wearing its name. It comes disguised as helpfulness, as love with paperwork attached. After Arthur died, Evelyn moved through the house like a new owner taking inventory. She told me not to strain myself with details, and I believed her because grief makes fools of even the wise. I was 78, weary and hollowed, still waking up expecting to hear Arthur's soft whistling from the kitchen. She began visiting daily, armed with folders and that brisk managerial tone people use when they've decided what's best for you. "Mom, we need to make sure everything's in order," she'd say, opening her laptop as though I were a client rather than a mother. I've spoken with a financial advisor, well, Robert's colleague, really, and he says the easiest way to simplify your estate is to consolidate. You know, fewer loose ends when the time comes. She never said, when you die, just when the time comes. I nodded because that's what you do when your children start speaking to you like they're your parents. You nod, you smile, and you tell yourself it's kindness, not control. She brought documents printed on expensive paper, the kind that smells faintly of ink and intimidation. "It's just a joint trust," she said, sliding them across the dining table where Arthur and I had eaten breakfast together for 30 years. "This will make everything smoother. Taxes, utilities, inheritance, all that nonsense. You'll still live here, of course. It just formalizes things legally." I remember hesitating, not because I distrusted her, but because the language of law has always unsettled me. It's a vocabulary built for distance, not love. She must have seen my hesitation, because she added, "Don't worry, Mom. You're protected. I'd never let anything happen to you." That protected landed heavy, like a door closing. I should have read every word. I should have put on my glasses. But she kept talking, soothing, persuasive, her tone the same one she used with her children when convincing them to eat their vegetables. "You're still the beneficiary," she said. "This just makes the management easier." I signed. I signed because she looked so sure, and because I was tired of being the last adult in the room. It's strange how fatigue can masquerade as trust. She thanked me with a kiss on the forehead, and then she gathered the papers quickly, like someone cleaning up after a spill. I watched her drive away that afternoon, her sleek silver car gliding down the gravel driveway Arthur had once shoveled himself. The wind picked up, scattering a few leaves against the windshield, and for the first time since his funeral, I felt the quiet not as peace, but as absence. The house had shifted somehow, subtly, imperceptibly, but I could feel it, like the balance had tipped while I wasn't looking. Weeks passed. Evelyn became the center of all decision-making. Bills began arriving with her address on them. She set up automatic payments from a new joint account I hadn't known existed. "Less hassle," she explained. When I asked for a checkbook to keep track myself, she laughed softly. "Oh, Mom, no one uses checks anymore. I'll handle the boring stuff." She said it like she was sparing me from burden, but what she was really doing was trimming my life down to something manageable for her convenience. I told myself it was fine, that this was just how the world worked now, that daughters took care of their mothers the way mothers once took care of them. But somewhere between the lines, the roles had stopped being reversed, and had become rewritten. I wasn't being cared for. I was being managed. The first time I noticed the change in her eyes was during one of her weekend visits. She walked through the house with her phone in hand, taking photos of the furniture, the art, even the china cabinet that had belonged to my grandmother. "Just for insurance purposes," she said. "Robert's company can get us a better rate if we have visual documentation." Us. The pronoun slid past me at first, but later that night, lying in bed, it echoed. Us, not you, not your house. Us. I began to understand the slow erasure taking place, polite and deliberate, the way mildew spreads quietly until you notice it's eaten the walls. When the bank statement stopped coming altogether, I called the branch myself. The woman on the line was polite, hesitant. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harlow, but your account access was converted under the trust. You'll need your trustee's authorization for any direct changes." "My trustee?" I asked, though I already knew. "That would be your daughter, Mrs. Evelyn Merritt." The words hung in the air between us. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there in my kitchen. The sunlight fractured across the table through the lace curtains I'd sewn 40 years ago. The patterns of light looked the same, but everything else had changed. I realized I had become a guest in my own life. Evelyn visited that evening, cheerful as ever. She brought takeout from a Thai restaurant, my favorite, as though pad Thai could mend what she'd severed. I watched her unload the cartons, the precision with which she placed them on the counter, the confidence in her movements. She had grown into a woman who lived without hesitation, and I admired that once. But now, watching her, I saw something else. The quiet satisfaction of someone who believes she's done the right thing, even when she's taken everything. "You look tired, Mom," she said, glancing up from her phone. "You should think about letting the gardener handle the front yard. We don't want you overexerting yourself." "We don't," I repeated softly, and she didn't even notice. It's easy to rewrite history when the people who remember it are too polite to argue. I kept quiet, but I began keeping copies. Receipts, old bank slips, photographs of the title deed Arthur and I had signed all those years ago. I tucked them into an old sewing box beneath the spools of thread, the ones I used to mend her clothes when she was a child. There was something sacred about that act, the small defiance of preserving evidence when everyone around you insists on forgetting. The moment of full clarity came in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. Evelyn came by unannounced, arms full of shopping bags, her coat dusted with snow. "We need to talk about next year," she said brightly. "Robert and I are thinking of renting the house for a few months, just while we travel. It'll cover the taxes and maybe even make a profit. You can stay at the condo downtown. It's closer to the hospital if you ever need anything." She said it like she was offering me a favor. I stared at her, speechless. "Rent the house?" I finally managed. "This house?" She nodded, brushing a stray hair from her face. "It's just sitting here, Mom. It's a great property, and the market's strong. You'd still have your room at the condo. It's temporary." Temporary. That word hit harder than I expected. I realized then that, to her, my presence was also temporary. After she left, I walked through each room slowly, touching the edges of things as though they were fading photographs. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon. I'd baked cookies the day before, the kind Arthur used to dunk in his coffee. The air still held the echo of him, of us. I stood by the window, watching snow fall over the frozen lake, and whispered his name into the glass. It fogged briefly, then cleared, like a ghost exhaling. That was the night I decided to stop pretending. A few days later, when Evelyn returned with the realtor's card, and a list of potential tenants. I smiled and said I'd think about it. Then, when she went upstairs to take a phone call, I opened her folder and quietly photographed every document inside: the trust details, the property deeds, the financial statements, all of it. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger is noisy, and I needed silence to see clearly. What I felt was colder, more precise. I wanted to know exactly what she'd done, what I had allowed. Later that week, I took the bus into town for the first time in years. It was a gray morning, and the seats were half empty. The driver, a kind man with a coffee-stained cap, helped me climb aboard. I told him I was headed to the courthouse, and he nodded as though he'd heard that 1,000 times before. Inside, everything smelled of dust and ink. I asked for public records, my voice steadier than I expected. The clerk looked up, surprised. "You're on file as co-owner of the Merritt Family Trust," she said after typing for a long moment. "Do you need certified copies?" I nodded. When she handed them over, I felt the paper's weight, the weight of my own erasure documented in triplicate. On the way home, I stopped at the little diner Arthur and I used to visit after Sunday services. The waitress recognized me. "Haven't seen you in a while, honey," she said, pouring coffee without asking. I smiled weakly and told her I'd been busy losing my life by inches, though I didn't say that aloud. When I stepped back outside, the snow had stopped, and the world was quiet, muffled, waiting. I looked at the bus schedule and felt an unfamiliar thrill, the kind that comes when you realize you've been asleep for too long and just woke up in the middle of your own story. That night, I placed the documents in an envelope and wrote a name on it: Ms. Ramirez, Legal Aid Office. I'd met her once years ago when Arthur was fighting a zoning issue over the property line. She'd been sharp, kind, no nonsense. I didn't know if she still worked there, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I finally had something solid in my hands: proof, direction, agency. When Evelyn called the next morning to remind me of the family plan, I told her I was running errands. "Don't overdo it," she said cheerfully. I smiled into the phone and promised I wouldn't. Then I hung up, put on my coat, and stepped outside into the pale winter sun. The air smelled of pine and cold iron. I didn't know exactly what I was walking toward, but I knew what I was walking away from: the slow suffocation of being managed out of my own life. That was the true catalyst, not her betrayal, but my awakening. Betrayal is a knife. Awakening is the hand that finally pulls it out. It did not collapse in a single afternoon. It sagged, unthreaded, came apart like an old hem under constant tug, and if anyone had asked me to point to the exact moment when the fabric of my life began to loosen, I could only have said it was in the way the mail no longer arrived with my name first, in the pause the pharmacist took before handing me my refill, in the new way Evelyn set a glass of water by my plate, as if I might forget the mechanics of drinking without a reminder, and because quiet harm prefers quiet rooms. She began with arrangements that sounded like favors, a house cleaning service that specialized in seniors, appeared on Tuesdays, and moved my things into labeled baskets I had not requested, my knitting to one box, and my letters to another, and my photographs into an album that stripped them of their hiding places and their warmth. And when I protested that I knew where everything already was, she smiled with the patience of a flight attendant and told me organization helps the brain, then installed a small device on the wall that announced the day and date every morning in a cheerful voice that made me feel museumed rather than helped. And I noticed how language had turned slippery in the house, how simple questions became permissions. "May I make tea?" became perhaps we shouldn't overdo the caffeine. "Shall I take a walk?" became the driveway. Is icy, let's stay in. And each suggestion arrived with a soft blanket of reason, so that to push back felt petty, ungrateful, even unkind. The bank was the next corner to turn, and she took it gently enough that a stranger might have applauded her, because she did not cancel my card or seize my checkbook. She only shifted the riverbed so that the current ran through her hands before it. Reached me, a new debit card arrived with a floral design and a spending limit for safety, she said. And when I asked what safety had to do with groceries, she explained that scams target the elderly and I should think of it as armor. Then she installed an app on my phone that chirped whenever I used the card so she could keep an eye on things. And the first time the chirp sounded, while I was paying for raspberries, I felt embarrassed for reasons I couldn't name, as though I had been caught being alive without permission. And later that week, when I found my old checkbook missing from the drawer by the telephone, she said she had simply put it somewhere more secure, and I could always ask if I needed a check, which meant I would have to announce every intention like a child requesting field trip money, and I began to understand that needing to ask is its own small prison, the kind built of polite walls and soft restraints that leave no bruises. Even the house altered its posture, as if it too had understood it belonged to new management, and rooms that had remembered our laughter now learned the vocabulary of staging. Cushions plumped into perfect corners, quilts folded into photogenic, squares that no longer draped over my knees on late afternoons. The kitchen counters cleared of the little messes that make a life. The bowl of lemons replaced with an angular vase that shed light but held nothing. And whenever I set out a cutting board and the old bread knife with its fine nicks, intending to make toast the way Arthur liked it, Evelyn would appear with a bright alternative, a smoothie of spinach and banana that slid through my body like a suggestion I hadn't made, or she would whisk the knife into a drawer for safety and put a new plastic serrated thing in its place that crushed rather than sliced. And I thought how our days were becoming crushed too, not cut clean, but pressed into shape by someone else's. Convenience and the radio that had lived on the windowsill by the sink, the one that kept me company through weather reports and midnight call-in shows, was suddenly too loud, too staticky, too dated, and it migrated to a closet where sound cannot travel. And it was only later I realized my days had grown quiet, not because peace had arrived, but because I had been muted. Friends called less, though at first I blamed winter, and then I blamed the church, and then I blamed the slowness of the post, until I learned from Ruth, who still had the courtesy to say what she meant, that when she phoned the house, she was told I was napping or bathing or out for a drive. And while I did nap and I did bathe and I did go for drives when the keys were not mislaid, it seemed the timing of those necessities always coincided with invitations. And one Thursday, dressed for the quilting circle with my good brooch pinned to the lapel, I found that the car keys truly were missing, and Evelyn apologized in a tone as smooth as lotion and explained that Robert had borrowed them to get a duplicate made so we would have a backup, which felt reasonable until Saturday came, and the original had still not materialized, and the backup had not arrived. And I was encouraged to think of ride shares, because driving at my age can be stressful, and I thought of all the storms I had driven through with a car full of children and groceries and swallowed hurt. And I realized stress is a word that becomes a leash when someone else holds its handle. So I walked instead, and though the cold gnawed my bones, the ache felt honest in a way I had not felt in months. There were inventory days, though she never called them that. Mornings when Evelyn would arrive with a basket and a barcode scanner, which she said was just an app that made lists tidy. And she would ask lightly whether I needed all these vases, or if perhaps the China service could be consolidated since entertaining was behind us. And because I had been trained by love and habit to smooth the path for my child, I said we could thin a little. We could let go of duplicates. And she nodded, with a gratitude that felt like triumph, and wrapped the second best teapot in brown paper that whispered as it lost its shape. And later, I opened the hall closet and found more losses. Arthur's old raincoat, the chess set with one knight chipped, the ceramic duck he pretended to hate, and my hands shook, not with anger yet, but with the knowledge that the house was being repotted into a smaller soil, and I was expected to thrive with less root. Even meals shifted from communion to compliance, and whereas once I had cooked without asking, and the table had learned our silences and jokes, now there was a plan pinned to the corkboard with an optimistic magnet shaped like a sun. Monday salmon, Tuesday lentils, Wednesday kale, and each line carried a note about sodium and protein and heart health, as if my heart had never done a day's work until a spreadsheet told it to. And I found myself pretending to enjoy flavors that belonged to another life, nodding as if gratitude could season food. And when I suggested baking the apple cake Arthur loved, Evelyn smiled in that tight way and said perhaps another time, because sugar is inflammation, and I wondered what word she would use for the swelling in my chest that came from being told no in 1,000 amiable ways. The children, who once sprawled on my rug-building cities of blocks and asking for stories that left trails of dragons across the air, began to visit with the stiff courtesy of guests, and I could tell someone had explained to them how to be around. Me, the do's and don'ts delivered like fine print. Do hug Grandma, but gently. Don't ask her to run. Do tell her about school, but keep it simple. Don't let her lift you. And because children understand tone better than content, they learned the deeper instruction, which was that I was breakable and therefore burdensome. And their voices developed a careful brightness that kept me at arm's length. And when one of them reached for a photo on my dresser, and Evelyn said, "Leave that," with the kind of softness that bruises, I understood that even their touch had been managed. There were new rules that pretended not to be rules. Coasters appeared beneath every glass, with the implication that my hands left rings. A small mat materialized by the sink, with the implication that my shoes dragged in more than dust. A bell hung by the back door, with the implication that my comings and goings required a chime, and each edition arrived with a story about safety or tidiness or routines that help, and it is difficult to argue with help when you have been taught your whole life to accept it gracefully. But when I went to the linen closet for the heavy quilt that kept my knees from complaining and found it gone, replaced by a lighter, more washable thing, I sat on the floor with the shelf biting into my shoulder, and I let the quiet stack around me like snow, and I promised myself I would not drown under something so soft. The small humiliations collected themselves into a kind of sediment I swept under the ribs and tried to ignore. The way the delivery driver asked Evelyn to sign for my package because her name was on the account. The way the dentist called her after my appointment to remind her of my follow-up, as if I had misplaced my memory somewhere between the chair and the door. The way a neighbor mailing his taxes waved to her and said it was good of her to look after me. And I stood there holding my own, enveloped like a prop, and I began, almost without deciding to build a counterweight, not loud, not confrontational, just weight, copies folded into my purse, names and numbers written in a small notebook with a blue elastic band, a spare key too. The post office box tucked under the third book on the second shelf because I liked the feel of contingencies, and sometimes at night I would practice the sentences I would need, the plain ones that carry their own weather. I would like my deed. I would like my statements. I would like a copy, until the words felt less like defiance and more like breathing. When Evelyn suggested the condo trial run downtown, because stairs are unkind at your age, and it will be so lively for you near the park and the theater and the hospital, I said I could try a week. And in the short, bright apartment that smelled of new paint rather than memory, I learned how few objects it takes to make a place efficient and how many are required to make it home. The sofa leaned against me like a stranger in an elevator. The pots rang tinny and thin. The view offered buildings. That could not remember us, and one afternoon, while she was out and I was practicing being the kind of mother who does not break the furniture by sitting in it, I opened the narrow drawer of the console table and found a folder with my name clipped to the front, inside a calendar of my life written by someone else, doctor's appointments annotated with who would drive, exercise classes scheduled but not chosen, a column labeled finances with neat ticks beside tasks completed, and the last line said future housing options with a bullet that read research-assisted living wait lists. And it was in the long breath after reading that line that I realized a future had been drafted, where my opinion was a variable rather than a constant, and if I did not write myself back into the equation, I would become the remainder that is quietly dropped when the arithmetic does not suit. So the first escalation did not look like a storm. It looked like weather that never cleared, the overcast that makes you forget what sun does to skin. And while Evelyn would have described herself as devoted, and I believe she believed it, devotion that erases the person it claims to protect is just a tidy kind of abandonment. And as the days lengthened into a pale spring that softened the lake and let the frogs practice their evening math, I began to wake earlier, to leave the bed before the house noticed, to walk the perimeter of what had been ours, and then to keep walking, to the bakery where the woman behind the counter learned my order by the second week and never once asked who was taking care of me, to the library where a young man with a pierced eyebrow showed me how to print documents from an email and never looked over my shoulder, to the bench near the courthouse where pigeons practice their democracy, and I practiced the steady posture of a person who is about to pull a quiet truth out of her pocket and place it on a table. And though I was not yet ready to lay it down in front of Evelyn, I carried it like a stone warmed by my own palm, an anchor that gave shape to the tide that had been moving me without my consent. It was a Tuesday when I first walked into the legal aid office, not because I wanted a fight, but because I wanted a translation of my own life. The library upstairs smelled of dust and paper, the quiet kind that forgives you for existing. I had come to return a novel I hadn't read and found myself staring at a bulletin board full of notices, divorce mediation, tenant rights, will consultations. The word will caught my eye, the way certain words do when they've been circling your mind in silence for months. I stood there longer than necessary, reading and rereading the small print until a young woman with round glasses asked if I needed help. Her badge read Clara Ramirez, Legal Advisor. I hesitated before answering because admitting what I needed felt like confessing a weakness I'd sworn to hide. I think I've signed something I shouldn't have, I said finally. I'd just like to understand what it means. She smiled, not the professional smile of someone performing empathy, but a real one that softened the air between us. "Then let's understand it together," she said, leading me into a small room with walls the color of oatmeal and a window that didn't open. When I laid the copies on her desk, she treated them like something sacred. She didn't rush. She didn't ask if I was sure. She read line by line, tracing with a pencil, frowning occasionally, but saying nothing until she reached the last page. Then she looked up, and in that silence, I knew the shape of what she would say before the words came. "You're listed as co-trustee in name only," she explained gently. "Your daughter has full control of the assets. Legally, this house and the financial accounts are hers to manage. You have the right to inhabit, but not to decide. Inhabit, but not decide." The phrase stuck in my head like a splinter. I wanted to ask if that meant I was a tenant in my own life, but she was already explaining the possibilities, clauses, amendments, letters of intent. I nodded, though I understood only the rhythm of her concern, not its grammar. When she asked if I wanted to challenge it, I said no. I wasn't ready for war. I only wanted to know which parts of my world still belonged to me. She gave me a folder of resources and wrote her number on the corner of a brochure, underlining it twice. "If she pressures you to move or to sign anything else, call me," she said. Her tone wasn't pity. It was respect disguised as caution. When I stepped outside, the sun hit the pavement with that late spring glare that makes everything look sharper than it feels. I stood there for a while, holding the folder against my chest like it could steady me. For months, Evelyn's confidence had been so absolute that I'd begun to doubt the shape of my own memories. Now, for the first time, I had evidence that my confusion was not delusion. It was design. I didn't tell Evelyn about the visit. Secrets can be weapons, but sometimes they're shields. Instead, I began carrying the folder in my bag everywhere, as if knowledge itself were a talisman that could ward off dispossession. I returned to my routines, or what was left of them, with a different kind of awareness. When she reminded me to take my medication, I smiled and said thank you, knowing she believed gratitude was the same as obedience. When she brought new ergonomic furniture to replace the ones Arthur and I had chosen together, I helped her assemble it, watching her work with that efficient detachment that made me both proud and heartsick. But I was taking inventory in my head now, not of objects, but of freedoms. Each small act of control, each gentle correction, became data, a record of how invisibility is administered in daily doses until you stop noticing the dosage at all. At night, I began writing things down. Not the old sentimental diary entries of youth, but brief notations. What she said, what she moved, what disappeared. The notebook was small enough to fit in my pocket, blue with a tear in the spine. Arthur used to say that memory was our last line of defense. He was right. I wrote quietly, listening to the sounds of the house breathing its new air. Evelyn thought I was sleeping more. In truth, I was studying. By midsummer, I had mapped the rhythm of her controls so well I could predict her interventions before they arrived. It was like learning a dance I had never agreed to perform. One evening, I found myself sitting by the lake behind the house. The water was still except for the soft disturbances of insects skimming its surface. I had brought my tea and the folder, though I didn't open it. I just needed to feel the weight of it near me, proof that my life still had edges, borders she couldn't cross without my consent. I remembered something Arthur once said during a storm. You can't stop the rain, but you can decide which way to face. That sentence returned now, luminous and inconvenient. For the first time, I considered facing her, not as a mother pleading for affection, but as a woman reclaiming her ground. The shift didn't come dramatically. It came in the form of small refusals, quiet, almost invisible, but mine. When she suggested I join the senior Yoga for Balance class at the community center, I said I'd prefer a book club instead. When she replaced the curtains in the living room with sleek blinds, I rehung the lace ones from storage while she was at work. When she scolded me lightly about using cash instead of the card she'd set up, I smiled and said, I trust my own arithmetic more than algorithms. Each sentence was a pebble in the current, barely noticed, but slowly altering its course. The more she tried to streamline me, the more deliberate I became in my clutter. I left books open on the table, shoes by the door, photographs in mismatched frames. Rebellion took the shape of presence. It felt absurd at first, like resisting an empire by refusing to fold laundry. But there was something cleansing about it. The house began to smell like me again, faint traces of lavender and old paper instead of disinfectant. Even the cat, once wary of my hesitation, started sleeping on my lap again. Animals know when a soul returns to its body. Then one afternoon, Evelyn arrived unannounced, her car tires crunching over the gravel like a verdict. She was holding a glossy brochure, the kind printed on paper thick enough to make promises. "Mom," she began, setting it on the counter, "Robert and I think it's time we explore assisted living options. Not immediately, just research. Places where you'd have company, medical support, activities." I stared at the brochure. The photos were cheerful, sterile, people smiling at puzzles as if joy had been rationed into 500-piece fragments. "I'm not lonely," I said. "You're isolated," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." She meant it kindly. That was the worst part. I didn't argue. I only asked if I could keep the brochure to look it over. That night, I read every word, every line break, every euphemism. Independent suites, lifestyle freedom, compassionate transition. Each phrase was an apology written in marketing language for people who had outlived their usefulness. By the time I closed it, the sky outside was pale with dawn. I felt both older and sharper than I had in years. The next morning, while she was at work, I took the folder and the notebook and walked to the small cafe by the post office. The barista, a young woman with purple hair and chipped nail polish, smiled when I asked if she minded me sitting for a while. "Stay as long as you like," she said. I ordered one coffee and sat there for hours, writing a letter to myself. The letter was not a plan yet, but a declaration of existence. I wrote that I was not confused, that I remembered everything clearly, that my mind was not fading, but stretching, adjusting to betrayal the way bones adjust to weather. I wrote that love cannot be revoked like a credit card, and that silence is a form of inheritance too, though I no longer wanted to pass it on. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside the legal folder, between the trust papers and Clara's card. For the first time in years, I felt like the custodian of something that mattered. In the days that followed, I began walking into town more often, not for errands, but for air. I stopped by the second-hand bookstore, the florist, the small park where old men played chess with the concentration of generals. No one knew me there. No one managed my pace or corrected my posture. It was intoxicating. I found a rhythm to my solitude that felt like prayer, slow, deliberate, without audience. Evelyn noticed the change, of course. She asked if I was all right, if I was keeping busy. I told her I was, though she didn't ask with real curiosity. Her concern was procedural, but mine had become personal. The turning point came in late July, on a day so hot that even the bees seemed drunk on it. Evelyn was on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low and efficient. Yes, Mom's still here, she said. No, we haven't listed it yet. I'm waiting for the right moment. She didn't see me standing in the hallway. She didn't see how still I became, how my fingers pressed into the doorframe until they hurt. Listed it. The house. My house. Ours once, hers now. The conversation was brief. The silence after it, endless. She left for a meeting soon after, and I sat at the table for a long time, staring at nothing. Then I reached for my folder. It's strange how decisiveness can feel like peace. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy, and she had taken enough of that already. I only felt an evenness, like water settling after a stone has been thrown. I knew then that I would leave, not as an exile, but as a witness escaping the scene of her own erasure. But before I could go, I needed to make sure the truth had a paper trail. That evening, I called Clara and asked for an appointment. Her voice on the line was calm, professional, but I could hear the undertone of recognition. "You're ready?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and the word came out stronger than I expected. When I hung up, the air in the house felt different, thinner, yet breathable. The blinds Evelyn had chosen let in slats of moonlight that cut the room into stripes of silver and shadow. I sat there, watching the pattern shift with the breeze, thinking about how even light, when controlled, becomes decoration instead of warmth. For months, I had been surviving inside her architecture of concern. Now, quietly, I was drafting my own. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, tracing the ceiling cracks that formed faint constellations. Somewhere between them, I saw the outline of a door. Not the kind you walk through, but the kind that opens inward into the space you forgot you owned. It occurred to me that perhaps freedom doesn't begin with movement, but with permission to believe your version of the story, to call your loss by its right name, to stop apologizing for breathing the air someone else wanted to measure. I turned on the lamp, opened the notebook, and wrote one final line before dawn. I have been mistaken for fragile, but I am only unfinished. It began with the dinner invitation that did not feel like an invitation at all, but a carefully arranged presentation, a kind of performance in which I was expected to play the role of the serene matriarch who approves without truly understanding, and perhaps that would have worked if I had still been the woman she believed me to be. But by then, something had hardened and clarified inside me, a thin, cold line of resolve that hummed like a wire each time she spoke of the future, as though I were not standing in the same room. She called it a family gathering, her voice bright, her phrasing deliberate, and though she dressed it in phrases about togetherness and tradition, there was a bureaucratic tone beneath it, the tone of someone scheduling a transaction rather than planning an evening of warmth. "It's been too long since we all sat down together," she said. "I want to celebrate everything we've built." She said we, but what she meant was she, and perhaps also he, because Robert's shadow had begun to stretch across all her sentences lately, neat and assertive. I agreed to come, not out of obligation, but because the timing was too perfect to refuse. I had met with Clara the week before, and the new will was signed, sealed, and witnessed, the papers resting in a plain envelope inside my handbag, like a quiet storm waiting for weather. That afternoon I dressed slowly, choosing a navy dress Arthur had always liked, the one with the small mother-of-pearl buttons that caught the light when I moved. I pinned my hair in a loose knot, and as I looked in the mirror, I thought I resembled my own mother in her last years, composed, watchful, neither hopeful nor bitter, simply resolved. Outside, the day was crisp and too bright, that false kind of cheer that autumn sometimes lends to cruel moments. When I arrived, the house looked immaculate in a way that made it almost unrecognizable, as though it had been polished not for guests, but for appraisal. Evelyn met me at the door, her perfume sharp and expensive, her smile just slightly too wide. "You look lovely, Mom," she said, kissing my cheek lightly, her lipstick leaving a faint coral trace. "Everyone's already here." Inside, the table was set with the good china, the same set she'd once tried to sell online. Candles flickered in perfect symmetry down the center, and the smell of rosemary chicken filled the air, another borrowed recipe she now claimed as her own. Robert poured wine with the solemnity of a priest, his shirt sleeves rolled to just the right degree of informality. The grandchildren sat with their tablets, barely glancing up, and for a brief second I wondered if they knew what this evening was, if anyone had explained to them the choreography of dispossession disguised as celebration. I took my seat at the far end, where Arthur used to sit when he wanted to listen rather than speak, and I watched the family I had built perform a version of itself that no longer included me as more than a prop. The meal began with polite conversation, the kind that sounds like glass breaking when it tries too hard to resemble laughter. Evelyn asked about my walks, about whether I had finally joined that nice reading club downtown, and I smiled and said yes, though the club did not exist. She nodded, pleased with her own sense of benevolence, and then began talking about responsibilities and next phases in that careful tone people adopt when they're building a bridge to betrayal. "Mom," she said between sips of wine, "I've been thinking. It's time we made things a little easier for everyone. The upkeep of the house, the taxes, it's all too much. Robert and I think selling would be the best solution. You'd have your share, of course, and we could find a nice place near the city for you, with proper care." She paused, waiting for gratitude. What she didn't expect was the stillness of my face. I had practiced it in the mirror, the absence of reaction that unsettles those who rely on your submission. "I see," I said quietly, setting my fork down. The silence that followed was the kind that shifts the air. Robert cleared his throat, filling it with numbers, market value, maintenance costs, insurance premiums, each word meant to sound practical, inevitable. The children looked up briefly, sensing the unease without understanding its language. I let them talk, their voices weaving a net of rationalizations that caught nothing but their own self-interest. When they were done, I smiled, not with sweetness, but with precision. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, "and quite thorough. I can see you've done your research." Evelyn's shoulders relaxed. She mistook my calm for acquiescence. "I'd like you to read something for me," I added, reaching into my bag. Her expression faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face like a shadow. I placed the envelope beside her plate, careful, deliberate. "After dinner," I said. "It's better that way." The rest of the meal unfolded in a strange, suspended rhythm. Evelyn tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, school, travel, new furniture, but each subject deflated as quickly as it rose. I watched her hands, the way they trembled slightly when she poured more wine. She was used to power that went unchallenged, to the kind of control maintained through tone rather than threat. My silence unbalanced her. When the plates were cleared and dessert appeared, store-bought tiramisu served in delicate glass bowls, she finally asked, her voice too casual, "What's in the envelope, Mom?" I smiled again. "Something I thought you should see." She hesitated, then slid her finger under the flap and drew out the papers. The sound of the seal breaking was delicate but final, like the cracking of thin ice. Her eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed, then froze. I watched the realization travel through her, a visible current beneath her skin. Robert leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he read. The air thickened. Even the children sensed it and grew silent. Evelyn looked up at me, her face drained of color. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's my will," I said evenly. "The new one." She blinked, confused. But the trust." "Yes," I interrupted gently. "I've undone it, legally, carefully, and quite permanently. The house will go to the community shelter. The savings are set aside for the grandchildren's education. The rest," I paused, letting the words find their weight, "will stay where it belongs, with those who need it, not those who believe they deserve it." Her mouth opened, then closed again, like a door she could no longer control. "You can't do this," she said finally, the calm veneer beginning to crack. "It's already done," I replied. "You're welcome to read it aloud if you like." She didn't. She folded the papers with trembling fingers and stared at them as though they were a foreign language. The silence that followed was immense, not heavy but cleansing, as if the house itself had exhaled. Robert was the first to stand, muttering something about needing air. The children slipped away, unsure whether to comfort or to hide. Evelyn remained seated, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it might keep her from unraveling. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally, her voice small, almost childlike. "Because you said I'd get nothing," I answered. "And I believed you, for a while. But then I realized that getting nothing from you was the first freedom I'd had in years." For a moment, neither of us moved. The candlelight flickered between us, throwing long, trembling shadows on the wall. She looked older then, stripped of her authority, just a woman caught in the moment her certainty collapses. I didn't feel triumph, only a profound tiredness, the kind that comes after a long illness when the fever finally breaks. "You always wanted control," I said softly. "Now you have none. That's the trade." When I left, the night was cool and still. The stars were sharp, almost cruel in their clarity. I walked down the driveway slowly, my breath visible in the air. Inside the house, I could see Evelyn's silhouette through the curtain, rigid, motionless, still holding the envelope. I wondered if she would tear it up or hide it, but it didn't matter. The copies were already filed, witnessed, notarized. The truth, once written, doesn't need permission to exist. In the weeks that followed, the calls began, first polite, then pleading, then angry. "Mom, this isn't fair," she said once. "You're punishing me." I told her I wasn't punishing anyone. "I'm correcting the record," I said. "You confused gratitude with weakness. That was your mistake." She hung up on me, but I didn't mind. The silence afterward was clean. Then came the visits, unannounced, full of forced concern. She arrived one morning with flowers, her eyes red-rimmed, but her voice measured. "Let's talk about this," she said. "We can find a middle ground." I invited her in, poured tea, and listened as she spoke about misunderstandings and family bonds. But I noticed how her gaze kept drifting toward the desk where my papers were neatly stacked. She wanted to see if I would falter, if I would backtrack out of sentiment. I didn't. When she realized that, she changed her tone. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "One day you'll need me." I smiled, not unkindly. "I already needed you," I said. "That's how we got here." After that, she stopped visiting. The quiet she left behind was not loneliness. It was space, and I filled it with things that belonged only to me. I began volunteering at the shelter I had named in the will, sorting donations, folding linens, listening to the women's stories, tales of loss, of escape, of quiet rebuilding. None of them knew who I was or what I had done, and I didn't tell them. It was enough to move among them, to feel useful in a way that required no apology. Sometimes, as I watched them laugh despite everything, I thought about Evelyn and how tightly she clung to what she called security, never realizing it was the one thing that could never keep her safe from herself. But life, even after liberation, insists on testing you. One morning, months later, I received a letter from her lawyer, a formal notice, all polished aggression and veiled accusations. They wanted to contest the will, to question my capacity, to suggest that perhaps I had been influenced, manipulated, confused. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Arthur and I used to share coffee, and I read it twice, then 3 times, each word duller than the last. They were not fighting for love or legacy. They were fighting for possession. I called Clara that afternoon. She met me 2 days later with a calm efficiency that reminded me of why I had trusted her. "They can try," she said, "but the paperwork is solid. You've documented everything." She smiled faintly. "You did your homework." And indeed I had. Every conversation, every date, every visit had been noted. The notebook that began as a record of vanishing had become a shield. Clara filed the necessary responses, and when Evelyn realized she couldn't win legally, she wrote instead. Long letters, full of sentimental half-truths and appeals to guilt. She wrote about childhood memories, about the times I held her through nightmares, about how families should forgive. I read them all, each one a performance of remorse that never reached sincerity. I didn't reply. Some silences are not wounds. They're boundaries. It was during one of those long evenings, rain against the window, kettle humming softly, that I realized I no longer felt anger toward her. Pity, perhaps, but even that was fading. What remained was distance, clean and necessary. She had tried to own what could never be owned, a life, a history, a mother's love, and she had lost not because I fought, but because I stopped playing the part she had written for me. The following spring, I attended the opening ceremony of the new wing at the shelter. They had decided to name it the Harlow House, though I hadn't asked for that. The plaque was simple, the inscription brief, "For those who start over." As I stood there among the staff and the volunteers, I thought about how everything that had been taken from me had found a way to return, transformed. Loss, when met with clarity, becomes inheritance of a different kind. Later that week, I received a final letter from Evelyn. It was shorter than the others, almost restrained. "I hope you're happy," it said. "You've destroyed what was left of this family." I read it once and then tucked it into a drawer. Destruction and creation often share the same noise. She would learn that one day, though perhaps too late to change. Sometimes, when I walk past the lake in the early morning, I think about that dinner, the candlelight, the trembling of her hands, the envelope resting by her plate, and I realize that it wasn't revenge I delivered that night. It was truth, stripped of all its disguises. Truth doesn't comfort, it cleanses, and once you've been washed by it, you can never again live in someone else's version of your life. The day she finally confronted me was the kind of day that tries to disguise itself as ordinary, the sky mild and undecided, the air holding neither promise nor threat. I had been arranging the books in the small living room of my apartment, a habit I had taken up since leaving the house, stacking, restacking, placing them in new constellations, as if the order of words on a shelf could steady the rhythm of my breathing. I knew she would come. I had felt the tension of her silence gathering for weeks, the way weather gathers unseen beyond the horizon. When the knock came, it wasn't tentative. It was sharp, assertive, the sound of someone demanding to be let in, not out of need but entitlement. I opened the door to find Evelyn standing there, in a beige coat, too formal for the day, her eyes swollen not from tears, but from sleepless indignation. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside like she still believed she could. The scent of her perfume, once familiar, felt invasive in the small space. She looked around with an expression that blended pity and disbelief, as though she could not comprehend how her mother, the woman who had once kept a house so perfectly arranged it could host strangers without notice, could now live among mismatched furniture and soft chaos. "So this is where you've been hiding," she said finally, her voice flat but trembling around the edges. "I wouldn't call it hiding," I answered. "I'm just not where you expected me to be." She ignored that. She placed her bag on the table, unzipped it, and pulled out a folder thick with documents. The sight of it made me almost laugh. Even her emotions needed paperwork. "We need to talk about what you've done," she said, sitting down before I could offer tea. "I've spoken to lawyers, and they all say the same thing. This isn't fair. It isn't right. You've been manipulated." The word manipulated slid across the room like a blade. I had been waiting for it, though I hadn't known in what shape it would arrive. "By whom?" I asked. "By that legal woman, Clara, or whatever her name is. She's taken advantage of you. She's convinced you to do things you don't understand." I could see the effort it took for her to sound calm, to maintain the tone of reason when her anger was fighting to break through. I sat across from her and folded my hands. "I understand perfectly well," I said, "more than you think." She leaned forward, her nails clicking against the table. "You've destroyed the family, Mom. You've humiliated me. Do you know what Robert thinks? Do you know what people will say when they find out you left everything to strangers?" I let her words roll over me. Once they would have pierced. Now they merely touched the surface, unable to sink in. "They aren't strangers," I said quietly. "They're women who know what it means to start over. That makes them closer to me than you've been in years." Her face changed then, contorting with something rawer than anger, something closer to disbelief. "You're being cruel," she said, almost whispering, "after everything I've done for you." I smiled at that, not out of mockery, but recognition. "You took care of me the way people take care of an old clock they've stopped winding, polished it, displayed it, made sure it didn't tick too loudly." She slammed her palm on the table, the sound startling in the quiet room. "You think you're some kind of hero in this story, don't you? Some tragic saint reclaiming her dignity. But you're just bitter. That's what you've become, bitter and old and ungrateful." Her words were meant to wound, but I saw the fear behind them, the desperate need to reverse the shift in power that had already happened. "Ungrateful," I repeated softly. "That's a word that has followed women like me our whole lives. We're ungrateful when we speak, ungrateful when we say no, ungrateful when we refuse to vanish politely. I suppose it's consistent." For a long moment, she said nothing. The clock on the wall ticked with a clarity that felt almost theatrical, each second measuring the space between us. Then, quieter, she said, "Why did you do it, really? Why couldn't you just let things be?" I thought of answering her honestly, telling her about the nights I had lain awake tracing the geography of my disappearance, about how she had erased me, not with violence, but with kindness administered in the wrong doses. But I realized it wouldn't matter. The truth that freed me would only imprison her further. So I said instead, "Because I wanted to leave something real behind. And control isn't real, Evelyn. It's just fear wearing nice clothes." Her eyes filled, though she tried to blink it away. I thought I was protecting you, she said. From what? I asked. From living? She looked down, suddenly younger, fragile in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. For a flicker of a second, I almost reached out to touch her hand, but I stopped. Love is not the same as surrender. You think I wanted to hurt you, I said quietly, but I only wanted you to see me, not as a responsibility, not as an inconvenience, just as a person. You couldn't do it, so I had to remind you that I exist without your permission. She stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. You've made everything harder, for me, for Robert, for the kids. They don't understand why their grandmother hates us. I don't hate you, I said. Hate requires too much energy. I'm just finished being rewritten. She turned then, her expression shifting from wounded to defiant. You can't erase me from your story either, she said. You may have your will, your precious papers, but you'll die knowing your daughter despises you. I looked at her for a long time, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm enough to make her flinch. Despise is still a kind of remembering. It means I'll live in you, whether you want me to or not. She stared at me, breathing hard, then gathered her folder and shoved it back into her bag. You'll regret this, she said again, but her voice cracked on the last word. Maybe, I answered, but at least it will be mine to regret. She hesitated at the door, her hand on the knob, as if waiting for me to call her back. I didn't. She left without another word, the echo of her heels fading down the hall. I stood there long after she was gone, the air still vibrating with the force of everything unsaid. Later that night, I sat by the window, watching the city lights tremble against the glass. I felt no triumph, only an immense stillness, like the quiet that follows a storm when the air is too clean. I thought of Arthur, of the life we had built and lost, of the child we had raised who had grown into someone I no longer recognized. There was grief there, of course, but it was an honest grief, not the suffocating kind that demands you apologize for surviving. I realized that what I felt most was release, a lifting of the invisible weight that had pressed against me for years, the constant need to justify my worth to someone who measured it in signatures and compliance. A week later, I received a letter from the lawyer confirming that Evelyn had withdrawn her petition to contest the will. No explanation, no apology, just the formal notice of surrender. I imagined her sitting in her immaculate kitchen, the light too bright, the silence too loud, realizing that there was nothing left to take. Perhaps she thought I had won, but this was never about victory. It was about equilibrium, about restoring the simple balance between what is given and what is owed. That evening, I took the folder, the same one that had once felt like armor, and placed it in the drawer beneath my scarves. I no longer needed it within reach. I brewed tea, the kind Evelyn used to say was too bitter, and drank it slowly, savoring the taste. Outside, the rain began, soft at first, then steady, the sound filling the room with a rhythm older than forgiveness. I thought of her somewhere across town, listening to the same rain, perhaps remembering another time, another kitchen, when love still had a language we both spoke fluently. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sky was pale, the kind of gray that makes everything seem suspended between beginnings and endings. I opened the window, letting in the scent of wet pavement and cold air, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an observer in my own life. I was simply there, present, complete. I wrote a note to myself on the small piece of paper that still lay on my desk. You cannot be erased by those who come from you. It wasn't defiance anymore. It was a reminder. Months have passed since that confrontation, and sometimes when I see a woman on the street being guided too firmly by a daughter's hand or spoken over by a son who believes he knows best, I feel a pang, not of anger, but recognition. I want to stop them, to whisper what I've learned, that love becomes cruelty when it refuses to see you as capable, that care can suffocate when it forgets to ask consent. But mostly I remain silent, because each woman must find her own moment of clarity, her own envelope on the table, her own sentence that cannot be unsaid. I still hear Evelyn's voice in dreams sometimes, accusing, pleading, softer than it ever was in waking life. In those dreams, she's always younger, and I am always the age I am now. And we are sitting by the lake with the plum tree between us, and she asks me, "Why did you have to make it so final?" And in the dream I tell her, "Because you taught me that. Final means finished, and I needed something finished to begin again." Then I wake, and the room is quiet, and I realize that perhaps this is what peace actually feels like. Not joy, not resolution, but the gentle absence of fear. That afternoon, as I walked to the bakery downstairs to buy bread, the owner greeted me by name. "Good morning, Mrs. Harlow," she said. The sound of my name, unclaimed by anyone else, felt like music. I smiled, paid in cash, and on my way out, I caught my reflection in the glass. My posture had changed. I was standing taller, not because anyone was watching, but because there was no one left to please. I thought of Evelyn's words, "You'll regret this," and realized she had been wrong. Regret belongs to those who still want to return. I had no desire to go back. The only direction left was forward, and this time it was mine alone. In the end, peace did not arrive as a revelation or as a bright morning when the past suddenly lost its weight. It came instead as a slow settling, a quiet rearrangement of air and thought, a rhythm that felt almost domestic in its modesty. The days folded into one another with the calm precision of someone finally allowed to live without performing justification. I began to understand that life after a storm does not require triumph. It only asks for endurance, for the small decision to keep breathing, to keep putting the kettle on, to keep noticing how sunlight drifts differently across a table when no one is watching. My new apartment, which had once felt like a waiting room for exile, began to take on the dimensions of something gentler. The mismatched chairs no longer embarrassed me. They became evidence of choice, of history that refused to coordinate itself into perfection. Even the narrow window that faced the alley seemed beautiful in its honesty. It did not pretend to offer a view, only light, and that was enough. I started volunteering more often at the shelter, no longer as an escape, but as a form of belonging. The women there, each carrying her own version of vanishing and return, taught me something I had never learned in all my years of trying to be a good wife, a patient mother, a respectable woman. They taught me the vocabulary of resilience spoken without grandeur. One afternoon, while sorting clothes, a young woman named Marisa told me that the hardest part of starting over was not learning to live without the man who had hurt her, but learning to trust that she could walk through a door and close it behind her without permission. I remember standing there, holding a folded sweater, realizing that her sentence was my own story, spoken in another accent. We both had learned the art of closing doors quietly, and it had saved us. Sometimes, when I walked home from the shelter at dusk, the city felt almost kind. The bakery lights glowed through the fog, the smell of yeast and sugar wrapping around me like a memory I didn't need to escape. The people passing by didn't know who I was or what I had lost, and that anonymity felt pure. No one expected me to smile on cue, to forgive loudly, to pretend that everything was a misunderstanding. I could exist without explanation, and that was the most luxurious thing I had ever owned. On certain evenings, I would sit by the window with a book and the old radio tuned low to the classical station, and I would imagine Arthur's voice beside me, not as a haunting, but as a harmony. He would have understood what I did. He was a man who believed that dignity was not a gift others grant, but a discipline you practice in solitude. I think he would have approved of how I finished the story. Evelyn did not disappear from my life entirely, though her presence changed shape. There were letters at first, formal, careful, sentences constructed like fences. Then there were phone calls, shorter, less argumentative, her voice smaller each time. She never apologized, not directly, but there was a gentleness that slipped through the cracks of her composure, a kind of weary recognition. Once, near Christmas, she called and asked if I needed anything. I told her no, that I was fine, and for the first time I truly was. We spoke about trivial things, the weather, the children, a recipe she was trying. When she hung up, I felt neither victory nor sadness, only a fragile gratitude that we had managed to speak without wounds reopening. I have stopped wishing for reconciliation in the shape I once imagined. There are relationships that mend like fabric, stitches drawn tight until the tear vanishes, and there are others that heal like skin after a burn, tougher, altered, always aware of where the fire passed. Ours was the latter, and that was enough. Sometimes on Sundays, I walk by the lake where our old house stands. The new owners have painted the shutters a pale green and cut down the plum tree that never bore fruit. At first, the sight hurt in a way I could not name, but now it only feels distant, like reading the last page of a book you once loved but have outgrown. I sit on a nearby bench, watching the water hold the sky in pieces, and I think of how everything I once feared, losing, the walls, the garden, the illusion of family permanence, was never the foundation at all. What remains are the things no one can inherit, the patience learned in silence, the ability to see through kindness when it's used as a leash, the refusal to vanish politely. Those are my possessions now, and they weigh nothing. I have come to believe that aging is not a descent, but a distillation. The noise falls away, and what remains is essence, what you would have been if no one had told you who to be. In that sense, I am finally young. I wake early, sometimes before dawn, and watch the city slowly animate itself, light blooming in windows like a quiet applause. I make coffee strong enough to remind me I'm still here, and I write letters to no one, notes about memory, about small mercies, about the strange invisible power of refusing to be erased. I keep them in a box by the window, not for publication or posterity, but because I like the feel of my own handwriting asserting itself against paper. Words are small acts of ownership. A few weeks ago, my eldest grandson came to visit on his own. He is 17 now, polite in the careful way of young men who are still learning tenderness. He brought me a small gift, a brooch he said he found while helping his mother clean the attic. It was mine, the one I had once planned to give his sister before the arguments began. He said he thought I might want it back. I pinned it to my sweater and told him it suited me better now. As he left, he turned at the door and said, "Mom talks about you a lot, you know. She says you're strong." I smiled at that, though I knew he didn't fully understand the irony. Strength, for her, was still a word that meant resistance to collapse, not the quiet ability to stand unguarded. But perhaps he will learn. Perhaps that is what inheritance truly is, the slow education of those who come after, the hope that they might speak with more gentleness than we were allowed. I don't dream of retribution anymore. What I dream of now are rooms filled with air that smells of bread and lavender, of voices that do not rise to fill silence but rest comfortably inside it. I dream of women sitting together without fear of being called difficult, of hands folding letters without shaking. I dream of myself, younger and older at once, standing in a kitchen where no one asks what I'm doing there. I wake from those dreams, not sad but grounded, as though my body is finally made of the same quiet substance as the morning. Sometimes I think about the last thing I will leave behind, not the documents or the furniture or even the donations to the shelter, but the invisible shift that happens when one woman decides she will no longer be manageable. It is a small thing, easily overlooked, but it moves through the world like a current. Someone somewhere will feel it when she hesitates before signing her name to something that asks her to disappear. Maybe she will think of me, though she won't know my name. Maybe she will say no a little louder because an old woman once said it quietly. And so the story ends, not with reconciliation or regret, but with continuity. The cycle of control and silence breaks, and something freer takes its place, not perfect, not loud, but honest. I still visit the bakery every morning. The girl at the counter now knows my usual order, one loaf, unsliced, still warm. As she wraps it in paper, she always asks if I want it cut. And I always say no, because I like the sound of the crust breaking under my own hands. There's a satisfaction in that, a small, private ceremony of agency. I walk home slowly, the bread against my chest, and when I reach my door, I pause for a moment to listen to the quiet on the other side before unlocking it. This is my room now, my air, my story. And if anyone were to ask what I finally kept after losing everything, I would tell them simply this: the right to open and close my own door,